Authority is not a shared space between parent and child. Although some relinquish authority to their child, let me tell you, that is one of the worst things as a parent that a parent can do, and that is to submit their authority over to their child. And we'll talk about ways that people make this mistake here in just a second. So we're going to understand relationship hierarchy. So here's my objective for today: to understand the authoritative role God has given parents, and to see the benefits of cultivating subordination from our children. All right, so we want to see the God-given authority that you have as parents. This is all bottom shelf stuff today, nothing super complex. I mean, we've taken you through the ringer with Hebrews. Today, you get a bit of a break. You get something that's very palatable, but something that's very challenging for us all as parents. Okay, so again, I want us to understand the authoritative role that God has given us as parents, and to see the benefits of cultivating subordination from our children. And when I say subordination, we think, I don't mean insubordination, subordination. Okay, so your kid, your child, it is best for them that they obey you, that they understand that you are boss, that you are king and queen of the castle, so to speak, okay? They need to see dad as the leader. They need to understand the father as the head of the household. They need to understand these individual role relationships that parents have. And this is our responsibility, parents, that we teach our kids this hierarchical structure, because the dividends for them are going to be through the roof in years to come, and for now. And we'll go through all of that in just a second. So I'm going to kind of launch from two key texts today, but the texts don't need to be unpacked because they're very face value type of text. The first text is Ephesians 6, 1 through 3. I don't know if I put it on here. Yes, I did. Ephesians 6, 1 through 3, as we look at a biblical theme of parental authority. We know this text was, as children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is what? It's right. It is right. It doesn't mean it's a good idea. It means it is God's design. It is what God has instructed. It is right in every sense of the word. It's not just right, it's perfect. It's designed that way. It's best for you as a parent. It's best for your child that they would obey you. It's best for your child that you would have authority over them. Now, we abuse authority, and I'm not saying that's okay. But in a perfect situation, as we use our authority in a way that is right and proper, this is absolutely right and well for our children. Verse 2 says, honor your father and mother, which is, again, a statement of authority. You honor them because they are authoritative. They've been given to you by God in that role, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. So it's interesting that this call to obedience has also a promise attached to it, right? So parents, you can tell your kids, hey, it's right that you obey me, but there's also a promise attached to this, and we're not trying to create behavioral modification based on a stimuli. That's not what you're doing. You're saying, look, this is what Scripture promises us. I don't exactly know what all of this means, but here's what the Word of God tells us, that it may go well with you, right? Because I can look at my kids and promise them it will not go well with you if you disobey me. That I can promise you, right? And so God makes us that promise that it will go well with them and that their days might be long and they live long in the land. Colossians 3:20 is the other text. Again, there are a lot of these texts, but it's similar. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this is pleasing to the Lord. So these phrases, even though they talk about the obedience of children, necessarily scream the authority of parents, because why else is there a mandate for children to obey if parents are not given the authority to be authoritative and to lead? So they're one in the same. So here's the outline for today. I want to talk about what authority means. What does it look like to cultivate subordination from our children? And what does it ultimately accomplish? So 3 simple things, bottom shelf, easy to follow. And I'm sure you'll be able to keep up just fine. So what does it mean to have authority? What does it mean to have authority as parents? Parenting is authoritative. It absolutely is authoritative. Why do our children need authority? That's really the question that has to be asked as a subtitle under the heading. That is a question. What is authority? And why do children need that authority? Well, let me illustrate it this way. Today's going to roll off a little bit differently because I've got some illustrations and stories that I think are interesting. I may laugh. You may not. I don't care because they're funny to me. What does it mean to have authority as parents, and why do children need authority? Well, I think of children a lot like I think of a home in its beginning phases. Okay, so as a pastor, Austin's great with word pictures, but as pastors, we think a lot in terms of metaphors. There's so many things that are said and done around us all the time. We're like, well, there's a sermon in there, or we think of metaphors for something. And something that really stands out to me is this idea of how children develop in a way that's very similar to how a home develops. So you just track with me if you can, all right? So this is, if you arrive on the scene of a home that's being built and you arrive in the foundational phases, this is what you're going to see. You're going to see that here, especially because of the hills and stuff, but you might see a slab as well. Either way, you're going to see some cinder blocks laid like this. A footer was dug before that, right? And then everything's being built on top of that footer, and you have to have this foundation. So there is this foundational phase when it comes to developing a home. Well, then you want to start to provide some structure there. So you start to build up the walls, and you connect those walls, and then you put a roof on it, and then you want to get it in the dry. So there's your second phase, and hopefully there's no leaks there. A third phase would be moving in and doing your rough-in wiring and plumbing and all of that. Now, it's still a bit of a mess, right? But it's coming together. Right? You can see, because electricians are bad about this. I love you, Nathan Hutchison, but they leave a mess everywhere. Okay, maybe not Nathan, but the subcontractors that we dealt with, we're always like, why do you leave such a mess everywhere? But that's really the nature of it, because you're running these wires, you're clipping off wires, you've got plumbing pieces laying everywhere, you've got you've got cement and cleaner for plumbing that for some reason plumbers can't figure out how to take it from the ground to the trash, and so it's left there. But you've got debris everywhere. It's just completely unfinished, but there's a structure, right? There's something there that's being created, that's starting to kind of stand and take shape, right? But then you move to the next phase where you have walls getting drywalled and then painted. So it's not just structurally sound, but now there's some cosmetics, there's some finishing touches that are being put on it. So ultimately, you get to what really are the finishing touches, which is your finished product. Now, with the finished product, there's still touch-ups, there's still warranty issues, there's still all of these things that a home that has been brought from foundation to finish needs attention with. And so let's think of a child and how it kind of relates to these things. So a kid, whenever we have children, we're providing a foundation for those children. That's what you're doing. From the very beginning, when they're little bitty, we're teaching them obedience. We're teaching them, hopefully, first-time obedience. You're providing that kind of foundation. They're learning, I don't need to touch the stove, because they're associating that with a swat on the hand or a swat on the bottom or whatever it is that you're using to show them. So they're starting to build this into their mind. So you're creating this foundation. Now, I'm talking about little ones, right? Not necessarily even toddlers yet. Okay, that's where it gets really fun and really messy. But right now, little bitty babies, you're teaching them what you can. They're also learning that in a foundational phase that they can trust mom and dad. Okay, all the routine, all the patterns of nighttime, I put you to bed, I wake you up, I sing to you, all these things are building this very important foundation for a child. But then you move to the next phase where you start to build the structure. That's where you start setting boundaries for your children. And we would be foolish to think that our children do not need numerous boundaries. And why? Because foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. So it's foolish of us to ignore the foolishness in them. And it's neglectful of us to shirk our responsibility in establishing boundaries for our kids. Because the boundaries they set for themselves will either be non-existent, or it will not be safe or healthy or helpful for them at all. That's why God put you there, because you have a developed prefrontal cortex where they do not, where you can make decisions based on consequences where they cannot. So we create these boundaries, all right? So that's the building blocks and the structure that's taking place. Well, phase 3, we're continuing to build on the old and we're adding on some new, but things are still a little bit messy. Kids are getting it, right? We've got these boundaries. Sometimes they test those boundaries, even though they know that they're there, right? They know it. The boundary's there, but there's a testing phase. So they want to do that. So there's some messiness that comes with that. But you still set those boundaries. You're still in developing phases. You're still doing that. right? You don't quit building the home because it gets a little bit messy. You got to push through until it's on the end. And anybody who's been in the construction world understands that it's like that home stretch that seems to just drag on. It's all the things. It's like, okay, the framing goes up pretty quickly, got it in the dry, we're good to go. But then the real work starts, okay? Because the framing's not that bad, right? You can arrive on a scene and have not much of anything, leave that same day and feel really good because you've thrown up 4 walls and it feels like something. There's a structure. But man, when you get to the tedious nature of all the little details on the inside and all of the labor that goes with that you don't see until you've done a whole lot of it, right? That's where it gets really tough. That's where the grind shifts gears just a little bit, but things are still messy, but we're really moving along now, right? Then the 4th stage, you're establishing more of a rhythm and things are moving fairly smoothly, right? Because you're finally putting up that drywall, which is pretty huge. You got to mud it, you've got to paint it, you've got to do all those things. And then you move to the final phase, which when they're fairly grown and fairly trekking well, occasional course correction and fixing some neglected areas or messed up areas. And so that's the way that I think of kids. That's been my experience with the 4,087 kids that we have living in our house. It's been that way for me. Right? I think of that, and it helps that I've been in the construction world, and I think of these things, and I think of what it takes to go back and say, okay, there's a warranty issue here. Maybe I put that together poorly. Maybe I didn't have the wisdom at the time to coach and instruct and help develop, but now I do, and I'm going to go back and hey, I've got some new information for you. Maybe my son is struggling here, and 5 years ago, I didn't have the wisdom. I didn't have the experience to really speak to that issue. So then you come up with your touch-ups and your warranty, if we're following this metaphor out, and I come to him and say, hey, I've got some new information that may help you because I didn't really know how to coach you best then, and I know how to coach you better now. Right? So this is what it is to parent, right? You're developing baby humans to being adult humans, and you want them to function in society. You want them to be well, you want them to do well, but all along the way, it's construction, it's development, it's maintenance, it's warranty, it's touch-up, the whole way. That's how God wants it to be. But just like every job site, there has to be a foreman. There has to be an authority. There has to be someone that comes along and says, we need to give attention to this. We need to give attention to that. You need to do this. You need to do that. And you are the foreman over your children's lives. Authority has to do with 2 very important things: rights and responsibilities. It is your right as a human being, as God has designed you by right to have children, right? That is a right. That is your right. Just like it is your right as a U.S. citizen, unless you've had that right revoked, it is your right to go to the polls and vote. That is your right, right? It is my children's right, as Sarah and I a few years ago finalized our will. It is their right to be recipients of the very few things we have to give to them. But that is their right. Right? We have rights as parents. But once you enter into that right, by necessity, then you have the responsibility placed on top of you. Right? So the right means that we have the privilege by virtue of the fact that you are human beings to have and to raise children by God's design. The responsibility is, well, in a second, the responsibility means that we have the obligation to raise the child. Right? I have the right, we have a child. What do we do now? Well, now it's the responsibility of raising them in the way that God has designed and instructed us to raise our children. Not just raise them, but to raise them in a certain way within the parameters of God's design. In the parameters of God's design. Parents have the responsibility of authority over our children. Authority means that you have the God-given right and responsibility to make decisions on behalf of your children that will best look after their interest. Because they don't know how to look after their best interest. That's your job. That's your job. That's my job. All right? I think one of the most damaging effects of gentle parenting is that it strips away the authority that God designed for parents. And if you do research on gentle parenting, what you find over and over again is that it has been weighed and found wanting. Do your own research. Fact check me if you will. I looked into some of these things. The reviews are in, and it's not good. It's not good because at the heart of it, it strips away the parent's authority. It strips it away. And for us to have authority, for someone to look at that and say, oh, that's negative, that's bad. Abuse of authority is bad, right? An abuse of authority is bad, but God-given, God-responsible authority, God-instructed authority, God designed, following that authoritative paradigm in the hierarchical structure, that is this relationship paradigm between a parent and a child, is good for them. It's good for them. So the exhortation is to never surrender your authority over to your child. And I can give you this brief story. I won't say names. I mean, you wouldn't know them from Adam, but just in case. When I was a youth pastor years ago, I had a student, not a student that was around a lot, but a student that I tried to love very well and spent a lot of time with because I really wanted him to come to Christ. It's not Jake Elliott, by the way. Not Jake Elliott. But he was a tough case. And he had a mother that the dad was out of the picture. All right. And even when he was, it wasn't good. It was just unfortunate all the way around. So his mother, I want to say, trying to do her best, had entered into this relationship paradigm with him to where he dictated everything. I mean, this is like an 8th grader, 9th grader at the time. Right? I would hear them in conversations and he would berate her and she would almost be apologetic toward him for whatever she did wrong. For whatever joy she stripped away from him for not letting him stay up and eat, candy all night long or play his Xbox all night long or whatever, she would be very apologetic to him about those things. And he would kind of just walk all over. And it came to a point where one day I approached her and I asked her, why do you let him do that? You are surrendering your authority over to him. Now, this was a time when the father left and she didn't want him to pick the dad and to leave her. So he used the situation with dad as leverage to keep his mom where he wanted his mom, right? Hey, I'll go live with dad. I'll live with dad if you don't let me this, that, and the other. And so she acquiesced to how he was leveraging his situation to get what he wanted. And what she did was she surrendered her authority to him. Now, I'm not pretending that it's easy. It would be devastating if she were to stick to her guns, draw her lines in the sand and create her boundaries, and for him to just take off. That would be extremely difficult. I still don't think it's right to surrender your authority over to your child. And that's what she did. So that's what she did. And there's a lot of ways that this happens, right? And one is what I just said. We surrender our authority over to a child when we let the child determine what is best for themselves. Now, I'm not saying that we don't have moments from time to time and we put a couple of options in front of our children to see what they choose or to see how they process things. But I don't think what we're going to put before our children is, do you want a banana or do you want to put a blindfold on and play in a busy street? We still have these boundaries and this parental authority and this wisdom that we're exercising by saying, okay, I'll give you some options here and you can choose. And maybe they sense that there's some freedom, but it's still under your sovereignty. It's still under your control and the boundaries that you're setting and the safety that you're providing. And so maybe there's a scenario like that you could tease out and that could be an experiment in your parenting and seeing what your child might choose and all of these things, and that's fine. But ultimately, your responsibility and your role, because they cannot, is for you to consider consequence, consider what happens down the road, all right? And the younger they are, the less likely they are to consider the consequences down the road, okay? And so we surrender authority when we let our child determine what's best for our child. And one of the key examples of this that is the most detrimental thing happening in families today, and I can't begin to explain the neglect that's involved here, is when a child is allowed to it sounds so foolish even saying it, because it is what it is, to let a child determine what their gender is going to be. It's just stupid. It's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. And it's horrifyingly neglectful of a parent to do such a thing, because then you're crossing over into the God's design and male and female, and it is a woefully disastrous situation. But that's par for the course. And that's an extreme example, but these examples happen in many, many other ways. So we don't allow our children to determine what's best for them. That's your job. That's my job. But it also happens when we allow our children to cross boundaries without consequence. So you draw your line in the sand, but your child does what a child does, and they push the envelope. Now, I'm not saying there's not times where we show grace, right? We show grace. Something happens. We're like, okay, I'm going to show you grace. And that's a great teaching moment. But there's a difference in showing grace from time to time and negligence. There's a difference in showing grace from time to time and shirking your responsibility or being derelict in your responsibilities, because that child needs boundaries, and boundaries are therefore they're good. They're pushing those boundaries, which is going outside of the camp of what's good for them. And so the loving thing to do is to remind them in any and every way you can that these boundaries are for your good. If you cross them, there will be consequences. But sometimes we get lazy and idle. Because I just dealt with this 10 minutes ago. I mean, how many times do I have to do this? As much as it takes. There's no formula that says after 10 times you get it. And we'll get into a battle of wills in just a second. But, and this is all from personal experience with my oldest precious boy. It's like, really, not recently, but when he was much younger, 13, 15, whatever. Thirdly, we surrender authority when we refuse to set boundaries to begin with. So when they cross boundaries and there's no consequence, again, sometimes we extend grace, and I get that. And that's your discretion. That's my discretion, But as a pattern, there has to be consequences. There has to be. We read in the scripture that the Lord disciplines those he what? Loves. Right? And it's a strong statement to make, but if a family came to me and says, we love our child, we love our child, we love our child, and they say we never discipline our child, I would say, well, the Bible disagrees with that. Because biblically, to love is to safeguard. To love is to follow God's commandments. To love is to specifically place boundaries for the well-being, for the best interest, and for the safety of your children. So when we refuse to set boundaries altogether, we surrender authority over to our children. Because we let them determine for themselves what goes or where the lines are, and they just can't process that. They don't have the ability to do that. Children need boundaries because foolishness is bound up in their hearts. It is. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. Don't forget that parenting is stewardship, by the way. All right, so let me kind of add a layer to that. So here's your responsibility. Be authoritative, be decisive, win decisively every time, if you can. But parenting is stewardship. Remember this text right here. The psalmist wrote these words, the world is the Lord's and everything in it. Everything in it. In my Bible classes this past week, I actually talked about this verse. And I asked kids if they had ever worked or labored to earn money. Oh, yeah. And they would all raise their hand and tell me the different things that they did to earn money. And I said, so that's money that you earned. Were you allowed to do what you wanted to with that money? Yeah. Some of them told me what they did. And I said, well, and I brought this verse up. I said, well, what do you think that means about your money? And some of them, they got it. They go, and with this look of deflate and defeat, it's the Lord's. They realize all of a sudden it's actually the Lord's, and they got it. And some of them with furrowed eyebrows, like, whoa. You could see them processing this, thinking, no, that's mine. I earned it. And so they're being confronted with this worldview that everything belongs to God, and we are just stewards of these things. So if I give you something to be a steward of, if I give you stewardship, I am expecting you to abide by the parameters that I've given you, because you're a steward of something that is not yours ultimately, but mine. And I reserve the right to determine the terms. And so God has all of us, including our children, because everything in the world belongs to Him. So our children are His. And He sets the design, He sets the pattern, He sets the terms for how they're to be raised. And a part of that is to be raised under your authority, your absolute authority. That's what happens in stewardship as parents. We're kind of like a college to kids. If this is how I saw it in my mind's eye. We keep them alive and we educate them to be functioning members in society. Right? We give them room and board and we educate them because they're gods. Not they're gods, but they belong to God. And one day they're going to be sent out as arrows from the quiver, Ephesians 6, right? They're going to be sent out. No, that's Old Testament. Sorry, that's armor of God, Ephesians 6. But they're going to be sent out as arrows, right? These are important things, but we're stewardship. We are stewards. We've been given stewardship. And as stewards, your parental authority is defined by God's standard. Like babysitting someone else's kids, you'll ask the do's and don'ts to their parents. If I keep Elijah for Dave and for Jen, okay, so what can he eat? What not? You know, I mean, I have to get these details, right? Because I'm taking on temporary stewardship. I'm a caretaker of something that belongs to Dave and Jen, that ultimately belongs to God. So it's a double whammy, right? So that's about authority. So what does it look like to cultivate subordination? Here's where we get into some more of the practical stuff. What does it look like to cultivate subordination with our kids? It looks like creating boundaries. I've already mentioned boundaries, but I'm circling back to that because this is important. Children need boundaries because foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. One source said it this way: when we set boundaries for our children, we are acting as their prefrontal cortex. We are helping them make sense of the world around them in a way that their developing brains cannot fully manage yet. So there's a spiritual component, but there's a biological component here. In a very real sense, even in an atheistic worldview, this makes sense, right? For those that would reject the idea of God altogether, they would believe this scientific biological component that these children can't figure it out for themselves. We have to be there. That's what a bunch of parenting is. So a boundary that we set up in our home is we make a point to be careful how we speak about others. So if any one of us is saying something in a way about someone else that could be taken as gossip, we're hopefully pretty quick to call each other out, right? Is that gossiping? You know, sometimes it's referred to as spilling the tea, right? Are you spilling a little bit too much tea there? You know? We set these boundaries because these are implications for personal character for our family, for human beings. So the boundaries aren't arbitrary, right? None of us set these boundaries just because we can. And if you do, it's time to check what authority really means and what the end goal is, what your motivation is. If it's just to say, you can't do that because I'm boss and I want to feel the power and I want to be on this power trip just by dictating everything you do, then maybe check your motives, because that's not how a father or mother should really conduct themselves. But have intentionality behind it. You know, you are their authority. You don't have to establish that. You don't have to prove that. Maybe there are times that you need to remind that. But that is a God-given position. All right, the kid doesn't have to affirm you being that in their life for it to be so. God has affirmed that. God has put you there. So this has implications for personal character if we say, here's a boundary, don't speak ill of others. This is in place so that we might honor God with our words, right? So there's personal character development. There's, hey, want to honor God because you don't want unwholesome words to come out of your mouth, but only words that are edifying for building others up as there is time of need. This prevents them from establishing habits that will get them into trouble throughout their lives. If we have this boundaryless situation going on at home where people are just talking however they want to talk, and they're discrediting others, they're defaming others, they're speaking ill of everyone, and we leave it unchecked if there's no systems of checks and balances or any of these things, and we don't monitor that, if we don't take care of that, what happens when they grow up and they move out? What happens when they try to get jobs? What happens when they get in their other friendships and situations? They're not going to be liked. They're not going to probably be not going to do real well because they're going to be known as gossips. They're going to be known as those who just talk bad about others, known as those who can't control their tongue. And that's not just in the Christian sphere. That happens in the secular world. People don't like that. It happens all the time. So we're trying to protect them, and it's not arbitrary. These boundaries have implications and applications for their life. These lessons aren't arbitrary, but a child doesn't often see the rationale behind the boundary, nor are they always able to consider the consequences of crossing those boundaries. But what if those kids dishonor the boundaries? Okay, you've made your boundaries. Let's figure this out. Okay, let's how do we create or cultivate subordination? Well, boundaries first of all. But what if they cross them? All right, I've set boundaries, Pastor. You've told me to do that. Here's boundaries. You've got a boundary here, and if they follow that, everything goes well. Well, you can guarantee that they're not going to follow that. So what's the response to that? Discipline, right? Creating boundaries and consistency in discipline. This is where many people fall off the cliff, in the consistency aspect of discipline, right? Because that's the key there, is because the child's worldview has to come to a place where they realize that, oh, this pattern keeps surfacing. This keeps happening, and so eventually it connects. Oh, this is not okay. There's going to be a consequence, even though they don't know to call that. I'm not telling you which discipline to use. I'm just saying to start with, we'll get into some of that another time, but discipline, consequence, consistency in discipline. This is taught with the assumption that we all know that we must discipline our children. If you're someone that says, my child doesn't respond to discipline, eventually every child will respond to some form of discipline, unless there's something a major situation going on, okay? But maybe you're not doing it right, or maybe you haven't implemented the right form of discipline. It's easy to become lazy disciplinarians because there is a constant need for it, right? There's just always this need for developing these kids. There's always a need for instructing and training in righteousness. There's always this need because you're broken and I'm broken, and it's a broken, fallen world. So there's always this need. Even as adults, there's always a need for us to admonish one another, to exhort one another. That's what Paul says when he writes to one of the churches. When you come together, do these things. Why? Because you're broken and you're fallen. You're just a grown-up kid. And same kind of issues. You can bridle a little bit better. You can mask it a little bit better. Maybe you have a little more self-control, and that comes with age, but you still need discipline. You still need confrontation. You still need admonishment and exhortation, which is why the scripture tells us to do these things for one another when we come together. But laziness in discipline can create major problems, major problems. If it's a refusal to love our children, it's a major problem. It creates confusion for our children. Let's see if I have that. Oh, yeah. And I have this note in here because that's how I was keyed up in my own preparation. Let me offer this. We'll get back to our regularly scheduled programming in just a second. Fathers, and this is for me as well, don't let your kids disrespect your wives. Whether they're 3, 13, or 33, don't let your kids disrespect your wives. It is a shame unto you and an indictment unto you. Because what does it teach them? What is it going to teach them about their own wives? What does it teach them about you as a man and as a husband to your bride? What does it teach them if you just kind of walk away from it? That's your wife, men. It's a big deal. That's a big deal. If one of my kids disrespects Sarah, it gets ugly fast, okay? Now, there's sometimes blatant disrespect. Sometimes they don't realize it. And I say, hey, don't do that. They're not disrespectful kids, but everybody's human. Okay. But there are some, going back to that illustration I gave you of the student that I had that wasn't Jake Elliott, super disrespectful to his mom. Now, the dad was out of the picture, but a kid like that to the mom, if the dad's there, what an indictment on the man who just let his wife get beat up like that. It's not. In a way, it's abandonment. Because what are you supposed to be to your wife? All right, back to our regularly scheduled programming. Maybe somebody need to hear that. Commitment to winning. Here's the third one. So what does it look like to cultivate subordination? Commitment to winning. Battle of the wills. This is not easy, right? This is not easy at all. We've all had our battles. So when parental authority is challenged, James Dobson said, win decisively. When parental authority is challenged, you need to win decisively. All right, this is a big one. Don't give up the fight. Don't give up the fight. It's crucial that you win. I think of this is the illustration that comes to mind. Travis, who I just want to remind you, who rode a bull at 44 years old and broke half his body. Travis decided a couple of weeks ago that he was going to try to break this stud that they have at their house called Nomad. Nomad's a huge animal. And he was like, I'm going to, for funsies, I'm going to take, Nomad out to the paddock and we're going to break him. Now, I'm a spectator, right? There were a couple of spectators there. Really, we were there just to fast track the ride to the hospital. But Travis goes out there with this giant horse. Might as well be a dinosaur. Nomad's so big. So he goes out there and he's, they're trying to put all the things on it. I don't know what all the things are called, but the horsey things. So they put the horsey things on him. He's not crazy about that at first. So before they get all the horsey things tied up, Nomad decides, I'm not having it. Right. So Nomad starts to bucking. He was bucking. Right. He's like, roo, roo. He's doing this all throughout the paddock. It was like, and I kept looking at that thinking, that is a child. That's a child. Woo, woo. He's just going all over the place. He's not getting out of the paddock. He's slamming himself up against the fence. He's jumping and doing all these things, like a lot of energy to get really not very far. And I think that's a kid. I've seen it so many times because you just wait there and like when you calm down, we'll get back to our scheduled programming, right? And so Nomad exhausted himself. The poor thing's just sweating from every orifice in its body, right? I mean, he's not doing well, right? He's gasped because he's a little bit out of shape, right? The horse, not Travis, and Travis eventually is able to get on top of Nomad and walk him around the paddock, which was amazing to me. And I think that process has to happen several times, right? So that Nomad can be properly broken. And I thought, that is a kid. Now, I don't walk around telling strangers, hey, you need to break your kid. You need to break them, but the concept is there. There's a battle of wills that's happening. And a parent has to win. It has to win. Right? Not for the sake of winning, but for the good of the child, right? So a way that I think of wording it is that it's important not to think of this as fighting with your kids, but fighting for your kids. You're fighting for what's best for them because they need to surrender that will over because they can't determine what's best for themselves. You have to do that as an attentive parent. If you commit to winning, your child or children will be better for it. I promise you that. They need to be broken so that they can be directed, just like the horse, right? They need to be broken so that they can be directed. So this is important. You may say, but I'm not comfortable with some of these things. These things are difficult for me. I don't want to make them do something they don't want to do. I get that. That's parenting. We all face that. But we make them study and do homework because it's good for them, right? We make them do chores, don't we? So many things we say, you've got to do this. You impose your will because it's good for them. In the same way, when you're raising them up to create boundaries and their will kicks up, their sinful nature kicks up and wants to butt against you, then you have to win. The heart behind the battle of wills is that you are letting your kids know that they don't get what they want just because they want it. and that you will get what you want because what you want is best for them. They just can't see it yet. Okay? The question is, what about picking your battles? All right, stay with me. What about picking your battles? Well, sometimes you do pick a battle. I've seen times where battles were picked in a place that I'm like, maybe that's not the way to pick a battle. Let me tell you about a friend of mine. And we were at a Mexican restaurant years and years and years ago, and he sat there with his second born, who has to this day, about to go to college, stubborn as a mule, hardcore. But so is my friend. He said, if I ever write a book, it's going to be called Competitive Parenting. He did his doctoral project on parenting, right? So he said, when we were much younger, his girl was pitching a fit in the middle of the restaurant, just going to town, right? This was at Zimba's, Tina. And she was just letting everybody have, I mean, it was wild. Like when Sophia was little, Taraji would come out. We're like, Taraji's here. She would do that. We hadn't seen Taraji in a bit, but that's what, when Taraji shows up, let her have her wide berth. So what they did, this was crazy to me and awkward as all get out. So she's sitting in this chair. She's going crazy because she's upset because she couldn't eat something or whatever. They gave her an instruction. They gave her a boundary. And she's just throwing a fit. And everybody's kind of looking, and it's kind of awkward. And if you're the person sitting on the side, you're thinking, take your kid outside, please. But this is what he does. And then they go back to business. Now, I'm not saying that's what I would do. I'm saying that's what they did because they chose, we're going to fight this battle and we're going to win. Now, I wouldn't have selected to fight this battle with 60 other people dining on a Sunday afternoon after church, but they chose to. But the principle was they wanted to win that battle. It was important to them. Yes, you pick your battles. Sometimes you pick your battles on behalf of others. I get that, but you do pick your battles. There's so many stories about him and his daughter. One time he took his daughter outside because she was being just stubborn. And he was like, no, this is what we're going to do. No. He says, come outside. So she comes outside and he says, I want you to lean up against the wall. So she's leaned up against the wall. He's like, I want you to push on that wall as hard as you can, like you expect it to move. So she's just out there, just giving it her best. And he's just waiting. And he lets some time go by and she's exhausted. She's sweating by this time. And he says, how's it going for you? She goes, Dad, I can't move a wall. He says, and that's what it's like trying to win against your father. Because he's making this point that I'm going to win and I'm going to win decisively because I'm the authority that's in your life. Now, you might choose whatever creative parenting strategy you choose that's best for you and your kids and all this stuff. That's what he chose. All right. That's what he chose. Maybe we do pick our battles at times, but other times we live to fight another day, I guess. A part of commitment to winning is commitment to the boundaries that you've set. You get it? A part of committing to win is committing to boundaries that you set. Follow through with what you say you're going to do. Avoid sending mixed signals. We did first-time obedience with Wesley. And so this was one of those things where it was just over and over and over and over again until it finally clicked. So we had a desire that we wanted Wesley to respond to us the first time. Every kid is different, I get that. But for Wesley, we said first-time obedience, here's what we do. Wesley, we want you to do this. I want you to do this. Now, there was a consequence. It wasn't like a bad consequence, but we had to do something to show him that, no, when we ask you to do something as your authority, we want you to do it. Because the dividends for that are going to be astronomical in life, right? If he can learn, because he can have all these authorities in his life. If he can learn to respond and obey and acquiesce in the places that it's right to do so, like working solid construction, right? When the boss comes in and says, hey, Alan, I want you to do that. Yeah, I'll do that. I'm not trying to negotiate a deal with him. And why is that? Because my parents were strict on me about first-time obedience. And it stuck with me. It's just the way to go. And it pans out in life much better for those who kind of connect with that. So again, these aren't arbitrary boundaries or principles. You're setting them up for success in life, right? So if you say first-time obedience, we really want our kids to obey, but you're a counter, right? I want you to do this. 1, Two, what you're doing is you're teaching them they don't have to obey you until you get to a certain number. And remember that delayed obedience is still disobedience. We have to teach them to obey, right? Because you are the authority and they need to get that. And that takes a lot of effort and practice and discipline and consistency. Commit to discipline, consistency in your discipline. Are you a parent that likes to set time limits? All right, I'll let you stay up and watch a show a little bit longer. You got 5 minutes. 5 minutes are up, then what happens? Can I have 5 more minutes? Okay, you can have 5 more minutes. What happens when that's over? Can I just have 5 more minutes? Okay, and it may seem harmless, but are we not, if we're not careful, are we not creating a paradigm? Are we not creating a context to where our kid is going to question whether we really mean what we say when we say it or not? I would argue that if I go outside and I say, all right, you got 3 more minutes to jump on the trampoline, that it's best that when that 3 minutes is up, most of the time as a pattern, you get off the trampoline because you're teaching them that I mean what I say. It seems small, but if that's the pattern, if that's the relationship paradigm our kids are grown up, or that they grow up with, then they learn to trust that you're going to keep your word. They're going to learn that, okay, dad and mom mean this because when they say 5 minutes, it's 5 minutes. And then maybe they don't ask as much. And sometimes you show grace and you do, but the pattern needs to be that they can trust that you're going to do what you say and that you mean what you say. Otherwise, it's a disservice to your child because it's confusing. It lifts boundaries here and there, and they don't have the consistency that they need to understand what they need to understand. When we constantly adjust our boundaries and our expectations, it creates confusion and removes much needed stability for our children. Do you see that? This is stability for our kids, right? Otherwise, it's confusion and instability. And our kids need that. They need this kind of stability. They need this kind of structure. And the final one is that we have to communicate clear expectations. Create boundaries, consistency, and discipline. I alliterated this just for you all to remember. Commitment to winning and communicating clear expectations. Our kids cannot read our minds. So we need to communicate in a way that's very clear to them. Make sure that they understand what you've asked of them. Whatever it is that you want your kids to accomplish, make that thing clear. Otherwise, you will get put out or frustrated because of their failure to execute something that you failed to clarify. Be as clear as you can, as often as you can. Guess what? You may have to be a repeat offender and say, okay, let me explain this to you again. This is what I mean. This is what I want you to do. Small kids, small tasks. I had to learn real quick that certain children need one task at a time, need one manageable expectation at a time, right? Because I would get very frustrated. And then thoughts would creep into my brain, and not that I'm perfect at this. This has been a fairly recent revelation for me, is that these thoughts would creep into my brain and they're trying to challenge me. Sometimes they will, but most of the time it's not them trying to challenge me, whether it's my 16-year-old or whether it's Taraji over there, the 7-year-old. It's rarely that they're really trying to be rude or really trying to challenge me, but my sinfulness, my pride, these thoughts come in. If I don't take them captive, if I'm not careful, then I'm thinking, oh, they're trying to push me. Well, I'll show you. So then I bow up and I buck up. And then it becomes problematic because I'm not in the right headspace or the heart space to deal with them as I'm supposed to deal with them as a father. But I'm doing it out of anger. I'm doing it because my pride has been challenged. Who are you, Clay? Who are you to challenge me? I'm the potter in this household, right? So these are the sinful thoughts that creep into my mind that I have to take captive. But a lot of that can be avoided if I'm just clear. If I'm just clear in what my expectations are. Clear communication sets a child up for success and mitigates the problem of failure to meet expectations, which can then be devastating to a child. If your child feels like they constantly fail you, that can be devastating to the child. We don't want that, right? We don't want that. Talk about God's gift of giving a helpmate. My wife as a helpmate to me. The times that she sat with me and she said, either I was a little too overbearing or, hey, I support you. And, I'm being vulnerable with you guys. As my kids sit right here, she'll say, I support you in your discipline. I support you in in what you're doing, but be sure that you're affirming. Be sure that you're acknowledging the things they do well, rather than the things that maybe they missed the mark on, right? And my wife has had to say that to me several times, even as of late, because I can easily get in mode of, why did you neglect to do what I wanted you to do? Or why did you act in a way that doesn't represent the way that we've raised you, rather than the praise that comes with, hey, most of the time you do these things so well. And I fell at that. So communicating clear expectations can help to mitigate and to avoid all those nasty byproducts that can come. So a few tips that I think are helpful is communicate your expectations and have your kids say it back to you, to make sure that they understand. I learned that from my wife. I learned that with my wife, now that we've been in the foster care business for a while. That's proven to be very helpful. Here's what I would like for you to do. Say it back to me. Say it back to me, please, so I can know that you heard me. Model the actions you expect of them before assigning it to them, where that applies. Provide a rationale behind your expectations. Maybe this isn't every time. You don't have to do that. You are the authority. You don't have to say, okay, you're the authority, but it may help in a situation to provide the rationale. Let me just let you know this isn't arbitrary, that I'm actually thoughtful in this, right? And then offer positive reinforcement once the task is completed. Once the task is completed. And these things are helpful in communicating, clear expectations on the front end, and then following it up with positive reinforcement on the back end. And the final thing, just a few notes here. What does a proper relationship hierarchy accomplish for our children? I think of it of a hierarchical sphere, right? Teaching kids subordination and relationship hierarchy sets them up for success in the hierarchical sphere, but in three components of that sphere. And the first is the occupational sphere. As parents, we do have to keep in mind that our kids will grow up and they will be citizens, they will be in society, and that they will hold jobs. And we want them to do well, right? And part of them doing well in the occupational sphere is understanding the relationship hierarchical structure. Because most of them will not go into the workforce as a boss. Most of them will have someone to answer to, and it will go well with them, or it will be better for them if they have ingrained in them from the jump the hierarchical relationship paradigm, right? And I learned that from my parents, right? I'm not a wealthy man, but all the jobs I've ever held, I've had good relationships. I've been a good employee. And a lot of that is not because I have tremendous skill, but because I know how to maintain that hierarchical relationship paradigm. I understand about subordination and respect. I understand those things, and that goes a long way. A long way. So we're setting our kids up for success in the occupational sphere. We're setting our kids up for success in the parental sphere. They're going to be parents. And the question you have to ask yourself is, do I want them to be parents? Well, you have to ask yourself, am I the kind of parent that I would like my kid to become? And if not, that tells you something, and then you make the corrections, right? But at the end of the day, regardless of how well or you parent or not, the issue is we all want our kids to be successful as parents one day. We want them to exercise proper and correct authority. We want them to honor God in the relationship that they've been given as stewards of all that is God's. But we want to set them up for success in the parental sphere. And finally, we want to set them up with success in the Christian sphere. At the end of the day, I think we would all agree that, yes, we want our kids to have good jobs or whatever, but most importantly, we'll want them to have good standing before God Almighty. And a part of the way that we raise them, according to the scriptures, helps set them up for that kind of success. They need to have a proper relationship understanding to God as head, to God as authority, to them as subordinate to God Almighty. Who is the clay to say to the potter, why have you formed me this way? The potter, our God and Father, is the potter, and He is the authority. And He does with whomever He wants, whatever He wishes. And it's important that people have this worldview that in part is built by properly executing this relationship hierarchical paradigm. And the final thing is to remind you that children need you to be parents before they need you to be their best friend. They need you to be an authority in their life before they need you to be their buddy. They need you to be these things in their life because that's going to set them up for success. There has to be a distinction. There has to be a distinction. Does that mean we can't be friends? No, obviously not. But there needs to be a distinction in the hierarchy when it comes to our relationship to our children. So hopefully some of these notes were helpful for many of you. Maybe you implement these things. For some of you, maybe it's a good reminder. For some of you, maybe it's something you don't do well and you need to start to do that. But I encourage you to respond as God would have you respond in a way that is best for you, best for them, and best for who we are as image bearers, reflecting all that God is and all that God wants for us, okay? So I'm going to pray, and after I pray, you can take a 5-minute rest, and we'll come back here. And we assume the meeting will be fairly brief to go through some stuff, but we'll have a meeting. I'll present some things, open up the floor for questions, and then we'll take it to a vote, and then that'll be our day. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this morning. Thank you for what you've allowed me to wrestle with over, for a long time now, but to kind of put it together over these last few days. Lord, I thank you for exposing areas, bringing light into darkened areas of my life where I missed the mark as a dad. Lord, I pray that realizing I understand is one thing, but Lord, acting on the realization is another. So I pray for grace to act on that. Pray for grace that I need to be the father that I need to be. Lord, I pray for grace for my wife to be the mother that she needs to be. Lord, I pray for grace in the two of us, that you would unify us in our endeavor and our approach. Lord, that our children would feel loved, that our children would be appreciated, that our children will be raised in a way that is right and proper. Lord, that you might protect them in their future. I pray the same thing for all the families, the husbands and the wives, the moms, the dads in our midst today, whether their kids are older and moved out and on their own, or whether they haven't even yet had children. Lord, I pray that there are ways that you can make these applications for us that can benefit not just us, but for others around us. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.